Welcome back to my YouTube channel. She had always believed that love, especially family love, might not be loud, but at the very least it should be real. For years, she supported her parents without hesitation. Rent, groceries, medical bills, she handled it all quietly, telling herself she was doing what any good daughter would do. That morning, she called them just to check in. Her tone was warm, casual. Her mother said she was in the kitchen making tea. Her father mentioned the electricity bill had arrived. Nothing unusual. The conversation was short. She said goodbye, and they seemed to hang up. But the line stayed open. She was about to disconnect when she heard her father sigh, an exhausted, frustrated breath. Then her mother's voice, sharp and heavy with resentment. Living with her is awful, but we're only staying because of her money. There was no hesitation, no sadness. No conflict, just cold truth spoken like it had been sitting on their tongues for years. Before she could even process that blow, her sister's reaction sliced deeper than the words themselves. Her sister burst out laughing, not a nervous laugh, not a surprised one. A laugh of agreement. A laugh that said, finally, someone said it out loud. She froze. The walls around her seemed to vanish. In that moment, the world went silent except for their voices replaying in her skull. Her chest tightened, not with anger first, but with humiliation. Their laughter wasn't just noise. It was confirmation. Every time she thought her presence mattered. Every time she paid a bill without being asked. Every time she convinced herself that family loyalty was coming back to her in some form. It all suddenly looked like a transaction she didn't know she was part of. She hung up. Not out of rage, but out of self-preservation. For the first time in years, she sat still and let the truth settle. No excuses, no sugarcoating. The memories rushed in. Her parents staying with her rent-free until they got back on their feet. Her sister calling for money, but never for birthdays. The way they'd guilt-trip her for wanting personal space, or a vacation, or to spend her own earnings on herself. Not once had they said thank you like they meant it. She didn't scream. She didn't call back. She didn't even cry, not then. Instead, she stood up, walked to her desk, and opened her banking app. She canceled the automatic transfers. She called the landlord and removed her name from their lease guarantee. She contacted the utilities to pull her card from every account. She didn't announce it. She didn't warn them. She simply ended the contract they pretended was love. Days passed before her parents called, suddenly sweet, suddenly soft. We noticed the rent wasn't paid. Maybe there was a mistake? Her sister messaged asking if she could fix this small issue. She replied with 4 quiet words. Handle it yourselves now. They didn't understand immediately, but eventually, the laughter faded when the money stopped. She didn't cut them off from forgiveness, but she cut them off from access. And that distinction became her freedom. In the weeks that followed, she did something she had never done before. She spent her money on her own life. A weekend trip, a class she had put off for years. Fresh furniture that didn't feel temporary, and slowly, the ache transformed into pride. Not because she walked away from her family, but because she finally walked toward herself. And if someone out there is where she once stood, tolerating disrespect, calling it duty, funding the hands that belittle them, she has only one thing to say: love should never cost your worth. She never expected the day to start any differently. It was a calm Sunday morning, the kind where sunlight floats through the blinds and the world hasn't demanded anything yet. She made herself coffee, the kind she liked but never bought for anyone else, and sat by the window with her phone. Calling her parents had become routine, an obligation stitched into her schedule like brushing her teeth or paying rent. They didn't always sound happy to hear from her, but they never ignored her calls either. That alone kept her trying. She dialed them with the same casual tone she always used, smiling without any reason other than hope. Her mother answered after a few rings, her voice slightly distracted, probably busy in the kitchen. Her father was somewhere in the background, asking about some misplaced document. The conversation was quick and ordinary. Her mother mentioned tea, her father mumbled about the bills, and she asked if they needed anything. They didn't thank her for last month's transfers. They never did, but she had stopped expecting it. She told them she'd call again later in the week, just to check in. They said goodbye, and she waited for the click that signaled the call had ended. It didn't come. She glanced at the screen, assuming it would disconnect in a second. She stayed quiet, not wanting to be awkward if someone was still near the phone. That hesitation, those few seconds of silence, became the doorway to everything she didn't know she needed to hear. The line stayed open. And in the span of a breath, the tone in their voices changed. The politeness vanished. The affection she thought existed faded, like it had only been turned on for show. She didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even breathe too loudly. Something in her chest told her to listen, like the universe had wiped the fog off a window she never realized was there. Her father's voice came first, low and tired, the kind of tone he never used when speaking directly to her. He didn't hesitate or whisper. He spoke like someone relieved to finally drop a mask. He complained about the tension of living under her roof, about how he felt confined, about how every day with her felt like walking on glass. There was no gratitude in his tone, only irritation, like she was a burden rather than the person keeping the lights on and the rent paid. Then her mother spoke, sharper and colder than she'd ever heard. Her words weren't accidental or emotional, they were deliberate. She said living with her was awful and exhausting, that they were only tolerating it because of her money. No pause, no shame, no softness. Just the plain, unvarnished truth, spoken as if it had been sitting in their throats for years. She didn't sound conflicted, not even for a second. It was as if they had rehearsed this version of honesty in private, long before the mistake of leaving the call running. Before she could even absorb the sting of it, her sister reacted in a way that bruised even deeper. There was laughter, loud, unfiltered, unbothered. It wasn't the surprised kind that comes from shock or discomfort. It was the kind that comes from agreement. The kind that says this conversation had happened before, just not in front of the person being discussed. Her sister didn't defend her, didn't question the cruelty, didn't even lower her voice. She laughed like it was a joke they'd all been in on, except her. The laughter echoed through the speaker in a way that made the room around her feel smaller. In that moment, it became painfully clear that whatever she believed about their closeness had been one-sided. They weren't staying because they loved her, needed her presence, or cared about the relationship. They were staying because dependency was comfortable and she was convenient. The worst part wasn't the words themselves, but how naturally they said them, like they'd always felt this way and never planned to admit it. She didn't drop the phone. She didn't gasp or cry out. She just sat there, perfectly still, as if her body had gone offline while her mind scrambled to process what she'd heard. At first, there was nothing. No thoughts, no anger, just a quiet numbness that settled over her like frost. Then, slowly, her heartbeat started to pound, each thud reminding her that the pain was real. The room around her seemed to blur, not because of tears yet, but because everything she believed up until that moment had cracked in half. Faces from her past flickered in her mind, the younger version of herself working double shifts so her parents wouldn't worry, the time she paid off her sister's debt in secret, just so she wouldn't feel embarrassed, the holidays she hosted because she thought togetherness mattered, the nights she lay awake calculating rent, bills, and groceries for everyone but herself. Every sacrifice she made replayed, not as memories of love, but as evidence of how long she'd been taken for granted. The sentences she overheard repeated inside her like an echo trapped in a tunnel. Living with her is awful. We're only staying because of her money. And then the laughter, sharp, unkind, dismissive, looped over it all like a soundtrack she never agreed to. Her chest tightened as a new realization settled in. None of them had slipped up. This wasn't a moment of heated frustration or a poorly chosen phrase. This was what they truly felt, spoken freely because they didn't think she was there to hear it. For a moment, she wondered if she had imagined everything. Maybe she misheard. Maybe context was missing. But the tone, the ease, the laughter, those were unmistakable. A slow ache spread through her, not fiery like rage, but heavy like betrayal, that had been building for years, disguised as routine. She remembered times they dismissed her exhaustion, brushed off her help as expected, or acted inconvenienced when she asked for the smallest kindness in return. Those moments suddenly made sense. Tears came gradually, not dramatic, just quiet streams slipping down her face as if her body had decided to release the truth before her voice could. The hurt wasn't just from the words, it was from the realization that she had built her life around people who saw her as a resource, not a daughter or sister. And the silence after their laughter felt louder than anything they said. She didn't call them back. She didn't correct them or demand an apology. The silence between them became her protection, and for the first time she let it stay. Instead of reacting outwardly, she turned inward, sitting in the heaviness of the truth she'd just uncovered. There was no dramatic outburst, no yelling, no desperate need to make them understand. Something inside her simply shifted. The version of herself that kept giving without pause, without limits, without being asked twice, that version quietly stepped back. She stood up, not in anger, but in clarity. The decisions that followed came naturally, as if she'd been waiting for permission she never realized she needed. She walked to her desk and opened the folder where she kept all the documents tied to them: leases, billing accounts, subscriptions, automatic transfers. Each click of a mouse, each cancellation, each removal of her name felt like stitching herself back together. She didn't think about how they'd react or whether they'd struggle without her. For once, their comfort was not her priority. It wasn't vengeance driving her. It was self-preservation. The more she looked at the numbers she'd been covering for years, the more it became obvious how deep their dependence ran. Utilities in her name, rent they hadn't paid in months, emergency costs she had absorbed without question. She updated accounts, disabled payments, and rerouted her finances back to where they should have been all along, her own life. No announcement, no explanation, just action. In the quiet of that afternoon, she also made room for a second kind of change: emotional distance. She stopped initiating conversations. She stopped feeling guilty for not checking in. She stopped justifying their behavior to herself with excuses like stress or age or culture or family duty. The spell was broken. The belief that love and sacrifice were the same thing no longer had power over her. She replayed their laughter in her mind, but this time, it didn't weaken her. It confirmed something she had ignored for too long. Staying available to people who only valued her for what she could provide was not kindness. It was self-abandonment. And she was done abandoning herself. She didn't need them to apologize to move forward. She just needed to stop giving them access to the parts of her life they had never respected. In the weeks that followed, the absence of her support became visible in their world long before they acknowledged it out loud. The rent that had always been paid on time was suddenly overdue. The automatic payments they took for granted stopped without warning. The small conveniences they never realized she managed, insurance renewals, maintenance fees, grocery deliveries, vanished one by one. Their calls came disguised as casual check-ins at first, forced sweetness layered over urgency. She answered only when she chose to, and even then, with the calm of someone who no longer needed to prove anything. She started redirecting her time and energy toward herself in ways that once felt selfish, but now felt necessary. The money she used to set aside for their emergencies went into a savings account with her name only. She replaced the worn-out furniture she'd delayed upgrading because another family expense always came first. She signed up for a course she had postponed for years. Every change, no matter how small, reminded her she was allowed to build a life that wasn't constantly siphoned by obligation. Emotionally, there was an ache that lingered, a kind of quiet grief for the family she thought she had. But alongside the hurt grew a different kind of strength, one that didn't rely on anger to exist. She stopped needing them to understand her worth. She stopped measuring love by what she could provide. The silence that once felt like distance now felt like space to breathe, to think, to choose. When her parents finally dropped the pretense and asked directly about money, she didn't raise her voice or justify her choice. She simply told them to handle their own responsibilities. Her sister sent messages heavy with annoyance, not remorse, and for the first time, she didn't feel obligated to respond. The dynamic had shifted, not because they changed, but because she finally did. People around her began to notice the difference, not in what she said, but in what she no longer allowed. The softness in her wasn't gone, but it was no longer available to those who treated it like currency. She learned to draw boundaries without apologizing and to give without draining herself. And without announcing it to anyone, she carried a new, unshakable understanding. Being needed is not the same as being valued. Others who once pitied her situation started seeing her differently too. Friends who knew pieces of her story saw the transformation in her posture, her choices, her voice. She didn't preach about independence or betrayal, but she lived the lesson in every decision, quiet, firm, and free. She never confronted them with the recording they didn't know she heard. She didn't chase apologies or wait for them to realize what they'd done. By the time they began to feel the consequences of her absence, she had already stepped into a different chapter of her life, one that wasn't built on being someone else's safety net. They still called sometimes, switching between guilt, anger, and manipulation, but none of it reached her the way it once would have. The difference wasn't in their words, it was in her understanding. She finally saw that love without respect is dependency, and obligation without appreciation is exploitation. And once you see that clearly, you can't unsee it. She didn't hate them, but she no longer sacrificed herself to be loved by them. The version of her that once equated generosity with worth was gone, replaced by someone who knew that distance can be an act of self-respect, and silence can be a boundary, not a wound. The pain didn't disappear overnight, but with every day she chose herself, the weight of what she overheard stopped defining her. And in its place, something stronger took root, a quiet, steady conviction that she would never again settle for being needed when she deserved to be valued. Her story wasn't about walking away in anger. It was about finally walking toward a life where her love, her effort, and her resources were no longer currency for people who saw her as a means to an end. And for the first time in years, that life belonged to her.